All right, how is everyone doing today? And welcome to my channel. It's an educational channel. I try to help you out with some great theories and discoveries and concepts that you've never heard of before because they've been suppressed. Things that the powers that be don't want you to know. And some of our powers that be are your preachers and your pastors and your rabbis who have concealed these biblical facts from you. And this is our 342nd Bible Decode. We've been looking at the work of the deist named Thomas Paine. And so this is kind of the deist perspective. Deism is really the idea that there is one God, but that God reveals itself not through books, but through God's own works, nature, and the creation, and that God has given us reason and other consciousness faculties in order to shed light on that nature and be able to understand the creation and the creator through our faculties. Not books. Books are the product of a human contrivance. And deism was kind of a big deal back in the days of the founding of this country. Many of the patriots that have founded this country were deists, either open or closet deists, including Washington and Adams and Jefferson and Madison and maybe even Monroe, Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin and Ethan Allen and Thomas Young and Freneau and probably quite a few others. But anyway, we are looking at Thomas Paine's book, The Age of Reason, where he discusses the two testaments of the Bible. And this book came out in the 1790s, well after the Declaration of Independence, which he was instrumental in getting across with his pamphlet that was called Common Sense. But we are at the part of the book right now where he's talking about the book of Ecclesiastes. The book of Ecclesiastes, or the preacher, is also ascribed to Solomon, and that with much reason, if not with truth. It is written as the solitary reflections of a worn-out debauchee, such as Solomon was, who, looking back on the scenes he can no longer enjoy, cries out, "All is vanity." A great deal of the metaphor and of the sentiment is obscure, most probably by translation, but enough is left to show they were strongly pointed in the original. From what is transmitted to us of the character of Solomon, he was witty, ostentatious, dissolute, and at last melancholy. He lived fast and died tired of the world at the age of 58. 700 wives and 300 concubines are worse than none, and however it may carry with it the appearance of heightened enjoyment, it defeats all the felicity of affection by leaving it no point to fix upon. Divided love is never happy. This was the case with Solomon. And if he could not, with all his pretensions to wisdom, discover it beforehand, he merited, unpitied, the mortification he afterwards endured. In this point of view, his preaching is unnecessary, because to know the consequences, it is only necessary to know the cause. 700 wives and 300 concubines would have stood in place of the whole book. It was needless after this to say that all was vanity and vexation of spirit, for it is impossible to derive happiness from the company of those whom we deprive of happiness. To be happy in old age, it is necessary that we accustom ourselves to objects that can accompany the mind all the way through life, and that we take the rest as good in their day. The mere man of pleasure is miserable in old age, and the mere drudge in business is but little better. Whereas natural philosophy, mathematical and mechanical science are a continual source of tranquil pleasure, and in spite of the gloomy dogmas of priests and of superstition, the study of those things is the study of the true theology. It teaches man to know and to admire the Creator, for the principles of science are in the creation and are unchangeable and of divine origin. Those who knew Benjamin Franklin will recollect that his mind was ever young, his temper ever serene. Science that never goes gray was always his mistress. He was never without an object, for when we cease to have an object, we become like an invalid in a hospital waiting for death. Solomon's songs, amorous and foolish enough, but with wrinkled fanaticism, has called divine. The compilers of the Bible have placed these songs after the book of Ecclesiastes, and the chronologists have affixed them to the era of BC 1014, at which time Solomon, according to the same chronology, was 19 years of age, and was then forming his seraglio of wives and concubines. The Bible makers and the chronologists should have managed this matter a little better, and either have said nothing about the time or chosen a time less inconsistent with the supposed divinity of those songs. For Solomon was then in the honeymoon of 1,000 debaucheries. It should also have occurred to them that as he wrote, if he did write the book of Ecclesiastes long after these songs, and in which he exclaims that all is vanity and vexation of spirit, that he included those songs in that description. This is the more probable because he says, or somebody for him, Ecclesiastes 2:8, I got me men singers and women singers and musical instruments of all sorts, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit. The compilers, however, have done their work but by halves, for as they have given us the songs, they should have given us the tunes that we might sing them. The books called the books of the prophets fill up all the remaining part of the Bible. They are 16 in number, beginning with Isaiah and ending with Malachi, of which I have given a list in the Observations upon Chronicles. Of these 16 prophets, all of whom except the last 3 lived within the time the book of Kings and Chronicles were written. 2 only, Isaiah and Jeremiah, are mentioned in the history of those books. I shall begin with those 2, reserving what I have to say on the general character of the men called prophets to another part of the work. Whoever will take the trouble of reading the book ascribed to Isaiah will find it one of the most wild and disorderly compositions ever put together. It has neither beginning, middle, nor end, and except a short historical part and a few sketches of history in the first 2 or 3 chapters, one continued incoherent bombastical rant, full of extravagant metaphor, without application and destitute of meaning, A schoolboy would scarcely have been excusable for writing such stuff. It is, at least in translation, that kind of composition and false taste that is properly called prose run mad. Now, I do know that the book of Isaiah, scholars believe that there were 3 Isaiahs, and that the first, I think 36 books were written by the first Isaiah, and then the next, maybe the next 20 or so by the second Isaiah. That was hundreds of years later, 200 years later. And then the third Isaiah was another 30, 40 years later after that. So that could account for its Thomas Paine's jumbled perception of it. And I also do believe that the prophecies that it makes that are concerning Jesus are interpolations that were put in probably by the 4th Isaiah or the 5th Isaiah or whatever. So let's see what Thomas Paine has to say here. The historical part begins at chapter 36 and is continued to the end of chapter 39. It relates some matters that are said to have passed during the reign of Hezekiah, king of Judah, at which time Isaiah lived. This fragment of history begins and ends abruptly. It has not the least connection with the chapter that precedes it, nor with that which follows it, nor with any other in the book. It is probable that Isaiah wrote this fragment himself because he was an actor in the circumstances it treats of. But except this part, there are scarcely 2 chapters that have any connection with each other. One is entitled, at the beginning of the first verse, The Burden of Babylon. Another, The Burden of Moab. Another, The Burden of Damascus. Another, The Burden of Egypt. Another, The Burden of the Desert of the Sea. Another, The Burden of the Valley of Vision. As you would say, the story of the Night of the Burning Mountain, the story of Cinderella, or the Glassen Slipper, the story of the Sleeping Beauty in the Wood, etc., etc. I have already shown in the instance of the last 2 verses of the 2nd Chronicles and the first 3 in Ezra that the compilers of the Bible mixed and confounded the writings of different authors with each other, which alone, were there no other cause, is sufficient to destroy the authenticity of a compilation. But it is more than presumptive evidence that the compilers are ignorant who the authors were. A very glaring instance of this occurs in the book ascribed to Isaiah, the latter part of the 44th chapter and the beginning of the 45th, so far from having been written by Isaiah, could only have been written by some person who lived at least 150 years after Isaiah was dead. These chapters are a compliment to Cyrus, who permitted the Jews to return to Jerusalem from the Babylonian captivity, to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple, as is stated in Ezra. The last verse of the 44th chapter and the beginning of the 45th are in the following words: That saith of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundations shall be laid. Thus saith the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him. And I will loose the loins of kings to open before him the 2-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut. I will go before thee, etc. What audacity of church and priestly ignorance it is to impose this book upon the world as the writing of Isaiah, when Isaiah, according to their own chronology, died soon after the death of Hezekiah, which was in BC 698, And the decree of Cyrus in favor of the Jews returning to Jerusalem was according to the same chronology, BC 536, which is 162 years later. I do not suppose that the compilers of the Bible made these books, but rather they picked up some loose, anonymous essays and put them together under the names of such authors as best suited their purpose. They have encouraged the imposition, which is next to inventing it, for it was impossible, but they must have observed it. When we see the studied craft of the scripture makers in making every part of this romantic book of schoolboy's eloquence bend to the monstrous idea of a Son of God begotten by a ghost on the body of a virgin, there is no imposition we are not justified in suspecting them of. Every phrase and circumstance are marked with the barbarous hand of superstitious torture and forced into meanings it was impossible they could have. The head of every chapter and the top of every page are blazoned with the names of Christ and the Church, that the unwary reader might suck in the error before he began to read. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. It's in Isaiah 7:14. Has been interpreted to mean the person called Jesus Christ and his mother Mary, and has been echoed through Christendom for more than 1,000 years. Now, if you know your mythology and your history of ancient times, you will know that many of the heroes of history and mythology were born of a virgin, such as Hercules and Socrates and I don't know if it's Zoroaster, and some who are even, what's his name, Apollonius. These are all people that would also fit the bill here for Isaiah 7:14. But apparently we only apply that to Jesus. Even though many of those characters, such as Socrates, are much more proximate in terms of history than Jesus is. You know, Socrates lived really in the same century that this line was penned in Isaiah, or at least much closer to history than Jesus. Okay. And such has been the rage of this opinion that scarcely a spot in it but has been stained with blood and marked with desolation in consequence of it. Though it is not my intention to enter into controversy on subjects of this kind, but to confine myself to show that the Bible is spurious, and thus, by taking away the foundation, to overthrow at once the whole structure of superstition raised thereon. I will, however, stop a moment to expose the fallacious application of this passage. Whether Isaiah was playing a trick on Ahaz, king of Judah, to whom this passage is spoken, is no business of mine. I mean only to show the misapplication of the passage, and that it has no more reference to Christ and his mother than it has to me and my mother. The story is simply this: the king of Syria and the king of Israel made war jointly against Ahaz, king of Judah. And so, Israel is the northern kingdom, Judah is the southern kingdom, and then Syria is also up north. So it's the Syrians and the the people of Israel versus Judah. and marched their armies toward Jerusalem, the capital of Judea. Ahaz and his people became alarmed, and the account says in Isaiah 7:2, their hearts were moved as the trees of the wood are moved with the wind. In this situation of things, Isaiah addresses himself to Ahaz and assures him in the name of the Lord, the cant phrase of all the prophets, that these two kings should not succeed against him, and to satisfy Ahaz that this should be the case, tells him to ask a sign. This the account says, Ahaz declined doing, giving as a reason that he would not tempt the Lord, upon which Isaiah, who is the speaker, says in verse 14, therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. And the 16th verse says, and before this child shall know to refuse the evil and choose good, the land which thou abhorrest or dreadest, meaning Syria and the kingdom of Israel, shall be forsaken of both her kings. Here then was the sign, and the time limited for the completion of the assurance or promise, namely, before this child shall know how to refuse evil and choose God. Isaiah having committed himself thus far, it became necessary to him, in order to avoid the imputation of being a false prophet and the consequences thereof, to take measures to make this sign appear. It certainly was not a difficult thing in any time of the world to find a girl with child, or to make her so, and perhaps Isaiah knew of one beforehand, for I do not suppose that the prophets of that day were any more to be trusted than the priests of this day. Be that, however, as it may, he says in the next chapter, in verse 2, that I took unto me faithful witnesses to record, Uriah the priest, and Zechariah the son of Jeberchiah. And I went unto the prophetess, and she conceived and bare a son. Here then is the whole story, foolish as it is, of this child and this virgin, and it is upon the bare-faced perversion of this story that the book of Matthew and the impudence and sordid interests of priests in later times have founded a theory, which they call the gospel, and have applied this story to signify the person they call Jesus Christ, begotten, they say, by a ghost, whom they call holy, on the body of a woman engaged in marriage, and afterwards married, whom they call a virgin. 700 years after this foolish story was told, a theory which, speaking for myself, I hesitate not to believe, and to say is as fabulous and as false as God is true. Okay, I think we're gonna stop right there. I am a little bit short on time here, and quite well on the head. I think he might have a few more words to say about Isaiah, and then we'll probably move on to Jeremiah. And this is all in Thomas Paine's book called The Age of Reason, which is part of our Bible Decode series, number 342. Please come back tomorrow for number 343. That is 7 to the third power. And we'll be getting into more Thomas Paine. Thanks for tuning in today. Have a great day.